Imagine for a moment that it is a Friday night. It's late September 1966.
Okay, setting the scene. I like it.
Yeah. So you're at home, the work week is finally behind you. You've got friends coming over. You've mixed a few drinks.
Stingers, I think, if we're being historically accurate.
Exactly. Stingers.
Yeah.
Heavy on the brandy. The vibe is supposed to be, relaxed, just chatter, little local gossip.
Just a normal Friday.
Right.
Yeah.
But then the energy shifts. A neighbor drops by. And this isn't someone just looking for a casual chat. She is vibrating with this frantic, desperate intensity.
You can almost feel the air in the room getting heavy.
Yes. Like that static charge right before a lightning strike. The pressure builds up.
It's that really specific feeling where the social contract just it starts to break down because the emotional weight in the room becomes way too heavy to ignore.
It becomes completely tangible. And suddenly, your wife, who usually channels a very composed, very wise personality named Seth, starts speaking.
But it's not Seth.
No, it is not Seth. It's her. But it isn't really her either. She is screaming. She is sobbing uncontrollably, literally writhing on the floor. And amidst all this chaos, she starts revealing these dark, buried secrets about the neighbor.
Details she has absolutely no earthly way of knowing.
None. Zero.
I mean, it sounds less like a relaxing Friday night with friends and more like the opening scene of a psychological horror film.
It really does.
Or, maybe a masterclass in physics if you view emotion as energy.
And that is exactly where we are going today. It is a phenomenon we are calling a psychic avalanche.
A great term for it.
It is the centerpiece of our deep dive today. We are looking at a truly wild, unhinged moment in the history of the Seth Material.
It really is a fascinating juxtaposition that we're dealing with today. For everyone listening, we are analyzing session 288 of the early sessions, book 7 of the Seth Material.
And the date of that record.
Monday, September 26, 1966.
Published, of course, by the New Awareness Network.
Always got to give credit where it's due.
Absolutely. And before we really jump into the chaos of that Friday night, we need to lay out our mission statement for this deep dive.
Because on the surface, this really just looks like a ghost story.
Right, but underneath, it is a literal manual on how consciousness works.
We aren't just recounting a scary story here. We are exploring the whole concept of emotional learning. We're going to look at the very real dangers of opening psychic doors too quickly.
What happens when the floodgates break and there's no filter?
Exactly. But because this is the Seth Material, we also have this incredible counterbalance of scientific validation later on.
It is a complete study in contrasts. We are going to bounce back and forth between this terrifying emotional breakdown and a very funny, very baffled experiment involving a birthday cake and a poem.
Chaos and control, fear and frosting.
Fear and frosting. I love that. That is the theme.
Yeah.
And just to get the housekeeping out of the way for everyone tuning in, this podcast will be distributed free of charge on all major platforms for educational purposes.
Perfect. So let's settle in.
Let's do it.
We really need to look at what happens when the psychic safety rails come completely off.
So let's set the scene properly so you, the listener, can understand all the variables at play here. It's Friday, September 23rd, 1966.
We are in Elmira, New York.
Right, at the apartment of Jane Roberts and Rob Butts.
And the setting is deceptively normal at first. Jane and Rob are there. They have company coming over, Bill and Peggy Gallagher.
Right.
And for those of you familiar with the material, these two are regulars in the Seth story. They provide a lot of the social grounding for Jane and Rob.
They're the anchor. And as we mentioned, the drinks are flowing. The source material specifically points out stingers.
Yes.
And for the younger listeners or those who aren't really well versed in 1960s cocktail culture.
Which is probably most of us.
Fair point. A stinger is brandy and white creme de menthe. It is a heavy hitter.
And they were drinking wine as well, I believe.
They were.
Yeah.
So defenses are down. Chemically speaking, the inhibitions are lowered in the room. Everyone is just looking for a good time.
But then the catalyst arrives.
The neighbor.
Yes, a neighbor named Barbara Ingold.
Now, looking at Jane's personal notes from this evening, Barbara brings a ton of baggage into the room. This isn't just someone popping in to borrow a cup of sugar.
No, she is described as being very emotionally charged from the moment she walks in. She is talking about suicide attempts.
Yeah, really heavy stuff.
She is talking about deep personal trauma. She is, for lack of a better term, broadcasting a very loud, very distressed, emotional signal to everyone in that apartment.
Jane actually notes that Barbara was sort of buying friendship, like she was insisting on doing the dishes, trying to make herself needed.
But also dumping this massive emotional load on everyone while doing it.
Right. Now, usually when things get weird or metaphysical in that apartment, Jane goes into a trance and Seth comes through.
Seth is the control.
He's the professor. He handles the energy.
Exactly. He acts as a buffer between Jane and the raw data. And usually, Rob or the guests might ask for a session in a tense situation like this to get some clarity.
But on this specific Friday, Jane puts her foot down.
She says no.
She wants a night off. She explicitly refuses to let Seth come through.
She just wants to be Jane for an evening. She wants to drink her stinger and hang out with the Gallaghers.
But Barbara is there, just radiating this intense distress. And this is where the entire situation goes off the rails.
Because Jane denies Seth, but she doesn't actually close the door to the energy itself.
That is the critical error.
Think of it like a dam. She refused the structured channel, the spillway that Seth represents, but the water pressure of the psychic energy in the room was still building up against her.
It had nowhere to go.
And suddenly, the dam breaks. Jane enters a spontaneous trance.
And when we say spontaneous, we mean instant and volatile. Seth isn't there to filter it. Jane isn't protected by that persona at all.
She's wide open.
She starts channeling information about Barbara, but it's not the philosophical calming advice we're used to. It's brutal hard facts.
It is raw data, just an unfiltered information dump. Jane starts spitting out names, dates, towns.
She mentions Greenwich, Connecticut.
She mentions specific initials. She's digging up details about a second child, a male.
And the physical reaction is what really distinguishes this from a normal session.
Yeah.
This isn't Jane sitting peacefully in her rocker, eyes closed, speaking in that calm, booming Seth voice.
Not at all.
She ends up on the floor.
Yes, it is incredibly visceral. She is sobbing. She is screaming. She feels like she is physically reliving a traumatic event from Barbara's life.
Specifically, a birth or some kind of medical operation?
Jane describes feeling like she is in a deep pit with smooth sides. She is actually experiencing the claustrophobia of the trauma herself.
Imagine being Rob Butts in this moment.
Oh, man.
You're watching your wife writhing on the floor, screaming in agony, channeling the darkest secrets of your neighbor, while your friends Bill and Peggy are just sitting there holding their drinks.
It must have been incredibly awkward, to say the very least.
Rob was not happy. The notes say he was highly resentful. He felt they were on display.
He was worried about Jane's safety, naturally, but also it felt like a spectacle. It felt dangerous.
It completely violated the controlled scientific approach they usually tried to maintain with the phenomena.
And Jane was terrified. When she finally came out of it, she was visibly shaken. She felt totally out of control.
It was so bad that they actually had to leave the apartment.
They did. At 1 a.m, Bill Gallagher drives them all around Elmira Heights, and Horseheads.
Just driving in the cold night air.
They needed to physically move their bodies through space to snap Jane out of this residual trance state.
That is such a stark image. The four of them, exhausted, scared, driving through the dark, just to get away from the energy hanging in that apartment.
It really highlights that this isn't a parlor trick. This is a force that, if mishandled, can absolutely run you over.
It was an avalanche. That is the exact term Seth uses when he finally comes through on Monday to explain the mess.
So let's fast forward to Monday, September 26th. The dust has settled. Jane and Rob are probably still a little on edge.
Oh, sure.
They sit down for session 288, and Seth, the voice of reason, steps in to do the post-game analysis.
And Seth, in his typical fashion, doesn't apologize. He explains. He frames the entire terrifying event as a necessary developmental step.
He calls it a giant step forward, right?
He does. Which seems counterintuitive given that Jane ended up screaming on the carpet. How is a breakdown a step forward?
It does seem totally contradictory. But Seth explains that Jane's abilities had expanded. She had access to more power, more perception than ever before.
Okay.
But because she blocked the usual channel, Seth, and because she didn't have the conscious discipline to handle that raw input yet, it completely overwhelmed her.
So the avalanche wasn't the ability itself, it was the lack of structure.
Precisely. Seth says, and I'll paraphrase, it was a kind of avalanche simply because Ruburt, which is his name for Jane, did not know how to handle the new conditions.
It's like hooking a fire hose up to a standard garden faucet.
Yeah.
The pressure's just way too high for the hardware.
He gets into the mechanics of it too. And this is where the physics of the Seth material gets really fascinating. He talks about the medium Jane traveled through.
Right, because we usually think of a medium as a person, but Seth talks about the medium or the atmosphere through which the psychic data traveled.
Yes. He says it wasn't air or space. It was the electrical and electromagnetic medium sent out by the girl's highly charged emotional condition.
So Barbara's distress, her neurosis, her trauma, that was the road Jane traveled on.
It was the carrier wave. Barbara was broadcasting this intense emotional signal, and because Jane's defenses were down, partly due to the alcohol, partly due to fatigue.
She rode that signal straight into the heart of the trauma.
Exactly. And this leads us to the quote that is the absolute anchor of this deep dive.
Seth says something here that is both profound and, honestly, a little frightening. He says to Rob, "If you do not learn emotionally, you do not learn."
It's such a powerful statement. Rob and Jane, and I think many of you listening who are interested in this stuff, we all want the cool side of psychic phenomena.
Right. We want the telepathy, the clairvoyance, the clean data. We want it to be scientific and safe.
We want the envelope test. We want to guess the playing card. We don't want the screaming on the floor.
Exactly. But Seth is saying that you cannot separate the psychic from the emotional. Emotion is the fuel. It is the connector.
He actually calls this scary Friday night event a visual aid.
A visual aid. That is a tough teacher.
He says that Rob and the Gallaghers needed to see the raw power of this reality. They needed to understand that this isn't just an intellectual exercise.
It has weight. It has force.
If you strip away the emotion, you strip away the reality of the experience entirely.
Seth even points out that a subconscious energy triangle formed between the three of them, Jane, Rob, and Barbara.
Yes, a highly charged subconscious energy triangle. And he notes that the Gallaghers, Bill, and Peggy acted as balancing factors.
Oh, interesting.
If they hadn't been there to ground the energy, it might have been even worse. They were the lightning rods that kept the house from burning down completely.
Speaking of the Gallaghers, I always love when Seth gives people nicknames. It adds this layer of real personality to him.
He calls Bill Gallagher the Jesuit.
Because of Bill's background and his argumentative style, I assume.
And Peggy is the cat lover.
It's charming. It reminds you that Seth is observing them not just as energy fields, but as people.
There is also a very practical note Seth makes about the chemistry of that night. We mentioned the stingers earlier. Seth confirms that the alcohol lowered Jane's guard.
But he adds a detail about the coffee. Right?
Oh, right. Jane drank a bunch of coffee before the incident.
Seth says the caffeine helped alert and direct the inner abilities. So you had this incredibly volatile cocktail. Alcohol dissolving the barriers and caffeine sharpening the focus.
It was the perfect chemical recipe for a blowout.
It's like stepping on the gas and cutting the brake lines at the exact same time.
That is a perfect analogy.
So Seth explains the horror show. He validates that it was a real psychic event, not just hysteria or a panic attack. But then in this very same session, session 288, we pivot to something completely different.
We go from the Avalanche to the envelope experiment.
And the contrast is clearly intentional. After discussing this wild, uncontrolled event, they move to a structured, double-blind test of clairvoyance. This is experiment number 71.
For those of you... Jane, or Seth, to describe it. It was their way of scientifically testing the ability in a controlled environment.
But there's a funny twist to this one. Rob prepared the envelope, but he actually forgot what he put inside.
Which is actually better, right? It totally removes telepathy from the equation. Rob couldn't be mentally broadcasting the image to Jane because he didn't even remember it himself.
Exactly. It makes it a pure test of clairvoyance. It forces the channel to look at the object itself, not the mind of the experimenter.
So Jane, with Seth's help, starts giving impressions of what's in this sealed envelope. And the list of hits is just bizarre.
She says a missionary connection, a staircase, 6 + 1, swirling about as leaves in a wind, and a square object.
Listening to that list, it sounds like random noise, a missionary and leaves. But this is where the detective work comes in. Rob opens the envelope. What's inside?
It was a draft of a humorous poem that Jane and Rob had written for Bill Gallagher's birthday, which was back on July 1st.
Okay, so a poem. How do we get from a poem to a missionary and a staircase? This requires some serious lateral thinking.
This is where we see the associative nature of psychic data. Let's break it down. A missionary connection.
Bill Gallagher refers to his workplace, the newspaper office, as the Garden of Gethsemane.
Because he feels like he's suffering there. Is his dark humor.
The poem actually spoofed this religious connection. So Garden of Gethsemane equals missionary connection. It's an association of ideas, not a literal picture of a missionary.
That is a brilliant abstract leap. Okay, what about 6 plus 1?
Bill's birthday is July 1st, the 6th month plus 1 day, or perhaps the 7th month, which is July. Seth says 6 plus 1. It's a numerological hit related to the date of the event the poem was for.
And the staircase.
Two connections here. The party was held at Jane and Rob's apartment, which is on the 2nd floor, so stairs are involved. But specifically, they hid the birthday cake on the stairs to surprise Bill.
Hiding the cake on the stairs. I love that detail. It anchors the psychic impression in a very specific physical memory attached to the object, which is the poem that was read at the party.
And the square object.
The cake box. A standard square bakery box.
But my absolute favorite part of this session, and maybe one of my favorite Seth moments ever, is the swirling leaves correction.
Oh, this is classic. So Jane got the impression of swirling about as leaves in a wind. She interpreted the motion of swirling, and her brain basically filled in autumn leaves, probably because it was September when the session took place and leaves were on her mind.
Right. But Seth stalks and corrects her. He explains that it was a translation error.
He says the impression was indeed swirling, but he wasn't talking about leaves. He was trying to convey the image of frosting.
The swirls of icing on the birthday cake.
Exactly. Jane perceived the swirl, but her conscious mind slapped the completely wrong label on it. She saw a swirl and thought wind and leaves instead of cake decoration.
That is such a human moment. It really shows the difficulty of this kind of communication. You're getting a symbol, a shape, a motion, and you have to guess what it means. It's like a high-stakes game of psychic charades.
It effectively demonstrates the difference between the raw data and the interpretation. Seth was sending swirly icing, and Jane received swirly leaves. It shows that even in a clear channel, the receiver's brain is an active participant that can make huge mistakes.
So we have this lighthearted verification. We have the birthday cake, the funny poem, the Garden of Gethsemane joke. It feels safe. It feels controlled. It's the exact opposite of Friday night.
It resets the mood. It shows that the ability can be precise and playful. It proves that psychic functioning doesn't always have to be a horror show.
But we can't ignore the dark cloud in the room. We have to go back to Friday night.
Because as wild as Jane's screaming fit was, the question remains, was she right?
This is the validation of the chilling data. And this is where the story takes a turn that honestly gives me goosebumps.
So, Friday night, amidst the screaming, Jane claimed that Barbara had a child, an illegitimate child, that she gave up for adoption. And she mentioned the year 1947 and the month of February.
At the time that Friday night, Barbara denied it. She told Jane, "Oh, that's amazing. You're picking up on a story about my friend. My friend had an illegitimate child."
The classic asking for a friend defense.
Exactly. And Jane believed her. They left it at that. It was polite. It allowed everyone to save face in a really tense moment.
But the truth always surfaces. We have a note in the source material dated April 10th, 1967. That's almost 7 months later.
Barbara finally confesses to Jane. She admits that the session had shocked her to her core. She couldn't speak the truth in front of the Gallaghers and Rob at the time. The social stigma was just too high.
So let's look at the scoreboard. Was the Avalanche accurate?
It was terrifyingly accurate. The illegitimate child was Barbara's own. She gave the boy up for adoption in February, just as Jane said.
Direct hit.
Jane said that Barbara was 17 at the time. Barbara confirmed she was 17.
Direct hit.
Jane mentioned a man with bristly hair and a mustache. Barbara confirmed this was the father's description perfectly.
And what about the trauma? The screaming on the floor?
Jane said she felt she was in a hospital room with green walls and felt intense pressure. Barbara confirmed she had a traumatic labor 25 hours long. She was pressured by the father's family, and the hospital details matched her memory of the event perfectly.
So the Avalanche wasn't just noise, it was history. It was a biography of pain that had been suppressed for 20 years.
And that explains the violence of the release. Barbara had been holding on to this secret, this child, this shame, this heartbreak since 1947. Think of the energy required to keep that suppressed for decades. That is a massive amount of potential energy. When Jane tapped into it, it blew the doors off.
It totally recontextualizes the whole triangle Seth mentioned. You have Barbara broadcasting this massive secret. You have Jane, unguarded.
Yeah.
And you have Rob witnessing it.
It brings us right back to Seth's quote, "If you do not learn emotionally, you do not learn." Jane didn't just know about the baby intellectually. She felt the labor. She felt the loss. She learned the reality of Barbara's pain by wading directly into it.
It's a heavy lesson. It suggests that true empathy, or at least true psychic connection, isn't always polite. It can be visceral. It can hurt.
And it suggests that we are all walking around with these emotional charges. We're all broadcasting our secrets, our traumas, our joys. We think we are private, but on an energy level, we might be screaming as loud as Barbara was.
That is a thought that will keep you up at night. If emotional charge is the medium of travel, what signals are we broadcasting right now?
And who is picking them up?
Exactly. This deep dive really drives home the duality of the Seth material. On one hand, you have the Jesuit and the birthday cake, the intellectual, the witty, the precise. On the other, you have the raw, screaming reality of human emotion.
And Seth demands that we look at both. You can't just have the parlor tricks. You have to have the human experience with all its messiness.
It's a reminder that psychic ability, as Seth defines it, is natural. It's like any other talent. It requires discipline. If you don't train it, if you don't respect it, it can overwhelm you.
It's like electricity. It can light your house, or it can burn it down. The difference is how you wire it.
Fear and frosting. I think that really sums it up.
It really does.
If you want to dive deeper into these sessions, and we really barely scratched the surface of the nuances here, you need to go to the source.
Yes, please do. Study the Seth Material books and visit the New Awareness Network website and bookstore at sethcenter.com/the early sessions.
Rob's notes alone are worth the price of admission. Seeing how he tries to make sense of his wife screaming on the floor while also analyzing a poem about a garden is just fascinating history.
It is the human side of channeling. It's not just a voice from above. It's real people living real lives, dealing with real neighbors.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. We talked about how Jane picked up on Barbara's secret because of the emotional charge.
Right. The intensity made it visible.
So if we only learn emotionally, as Seth says, are our most frightening experiences, actually our most educational, do we need the avalanche to really understand the mountain?
That is the question. Is comfort the enemy of growth?
Something to mull over while you're driving late at night? Maybe check your rearview mirror.
Maybe watch out for swirl and frosting.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time.
Good evening.